Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the Matilda tank. Now, the Matilda tank is actually two different tanks, the Matilda I and the Matilda II, and both were built for the exact same job to be an infantry tank for the British. However, the Matilda I is pretty much a failure, and the Matilda II had an absolutely amazing career. But let's go ahead and look at the British Matilda tanks. Now, the development of the Matilda tank came about as essentially an improvement upon World War I tanks. In the 1920s, the British were looking at trying to get away from these big, heavy, bulky tanks of World War I and try to create a much better, more efficient tank. And they came up with an entirely new tank doctrine as part of that. Now, unlike other countries that were developing a whole series of tanks, like I've covered before, between the light, medium, heavy, and super heavy tanks, the British came up with their own category known as the infantry and cruiser tanks. Now, I've already done a whole series on the infantry versus cruiser tanks, so please go back and watch that if you'd like to know more details on the individual tank classes. But essentially, an infantry tank is designed to support troops. They're usually more heavily armored, they're designed to move a little bit slower so they can be right there with the troops, versus a cruiser tank, which is basically like a reconnaissance tank or a tank designed to get behind enemy lines. Now, during the course of the development of infantry tanks, it was decided to try and create a cost effective version of an infantry tank, and they wanted to utilize as many off the shelf parts as possible. Initially, they were going to use just automotive components, but then they went ahead and started to incorporate equipment from different vehicles, such as the Vickers light tank, the Mark IV Dragon artillery tractor, and the Vickers 6-ton tank Model E. Now, the results of trying to produce this more economically viable tank ended up resulting in the A-11 tank, also known as the Tank Infantry Mark I Matilda I. Now, in all honesty, the Matilda I looks like it was built to be the cheapest thing possible. Its suspension, drivetrain, track system all looks just awful. It's very vulnerable to attacks from the side because of this. Somebody knew what they were doing, could very easily take out the track system on this tank. However, even with this, the fact that it was slow, it was cramped, it was pretty much obsolete before it even came into service. It did see some success in the Battle of France in 1940, but it was pretty quickly found that it was very vulnerable to counterattacks from howitzers and anti-aircraft guns. During the Battle of Dunkirk, it really didn't see much action, and it would pretty much be relegated to a training tank rather quickly after this. Now, while the A-11 Matilda I was being developed, there was some talk of actually building a slightly larger, heavier version of an infantry tank that was armed with machine guns and cannon to provide better proof against enemy artillery fire. But this plan, of course, had been abandoned in favor of the A-11 Matilda. However, within a year of the development of the A-11 Matilda, the A-12 was gone ahead and given permission to be developed. Now, the A-12 project went along with the similar economic reasoning of the A-11 project for the Matilda I, and so it utilized design elements from the abandoned A-7 medium tank project that the British had been working on in order to save cost. And so with this new A-12, they began to develop a much heavier version of an infantry tank. Because of this, it was the most heavily armored tank at the beginning of World War II, able to handle up to later tanks such as the Panzer III or Panzer IV, Sherman, or even T-34 by comparison of armor. And this heavier armor would be utilized during its first battle at the Battle of France. Now, unlike the Matilda, which was pretty easily taken out by artillery and anti-tank guns, the heavy armor of the A-12 Matilda II actually was able to go up against any German tank at the time or anti-tank gun and was actually found to be pretty proficient. In fact, the only effective countermeasure against it was the 88 millimeter flat guns. Now, the most famous deployment of the Matilda actually comes during the North African campaign from 1940 to 1942. And this is where it really shows its value as an infantry tank. It's first utilized against Italian made L3 Tank 8s and M1139 medium tanks, which, because of the heavier gun on the Matilda II against these early light tanks and early medium tanks, they really had no chance against it. And these tanks prove extremely valuable, taking out anything from the Italians in North Italy. And it actually takes the Germans bringing in their Africa Corps with those 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that the Matildas finally start losing large numbers. But even with that, the British continued to deploy them because they're a very effective piece of equipment, so much that the Germans were known to capture them to utilize as a backup vehicle for their own equipment. Now, sadly, after this, the Germans did begin deploying new tanks that had heavier guns on them and basically proved the Matilda to be useless at this point and ineffective anymore. So the British did start going into the replacement for the Matilda II. Now, due to the actual size of the Matilda II, you couldn't just stick a larger turret into it. They actually tried this and failed. So instead, the plan was to go ahead and just build a new infantry tank that could replace the Matilda II, and that is this, the Valentine. Now, the Valentine was designed to be very much in the same vein as the Matildas. It is an economic tank. It utilized many of the same parts, including the same gun, a similar level of armor protection, but was still cheap. And because of this, they went ahead and produced it instead of the Matilda, as they could produce more of them and kind of go with a similar mentality with the Emperor Sherman of just outnumbering your enemy's tanks. Now, while the Valentine signaled the end of the Matilda for the British, it would continue to serve very reliantly with the Australians during the rest of the Pacific campaign. Now, it was offered to the New Zealand military, but they preferred the close in support version of the Valentine tank. Now, the Australians modified it heavily, making it better for the jungle conditions that they would fight with. They utilized a variant of the Matilda that offered a 3-inch howitzer that was better against Japanese bunkers. And they even developed what was known as the Matilda Frog, which was basically a flamethrower version of the Matilda. Now, with these successes and the other developments that the Australians did to the tank, even though some of them weren't actually used, like the Matilda Hedgehog, which fired a 65-pound mortar shell, the value of the Matilda IIs was seen by the Australian military, and they kept them in their forces until about 1955, meaning this was the only British tank to see action from just before the start of World War II until its very end and a little bit beyond. Now, like many of the tanks I talked about, it did go through different variations and variants, with most of them being your standard improved engine upgrades, things like that. There were a few unique ones, such as the Matilda Baron and Scorpion, which were flail tanks, anti-mine tanks, or the Soviet modified version of a Matilda Mark III that had a 76 millimeter cannon off of a KV heavy tank. And of course, the absolute wonderful variants created by the Australians, including the Matilda Frog, the flamethrower variant, the Matilda Tank Dozer, the Murray FT, the Matilda Hedgehog. Now, if you'd like to see one of the Matildas today, there are 3 surviving Matilda 1s and 70 surviving Matilda 2s. And if you truly want to see these tanks in action, go to the Tank Museum. They have an absolutely amazing collection. They are on my bucket list to see, and you can see a Matilda 1 and 2 there. But there you have it, a quick look at the Matilda Infantry Tank. 2 tanks that were built to be part of an idea for this economical tank, one that could be built cheaper and quicker so that you could produce more tanks faster. And it's a great idea. It really is. It did have its shortcomings. It was very quickly outdone by better tanks with heavier firepower, but it was what was needed at the start of World War II. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.